Gary Palmucci, our curator, has chosen for today's talkback the masterful Academy Award winning 1961 film, West Side Story. The film is now celebrating its 60th anniversary. Gary will be joined by our wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez, and two other special guests, including filmmaker Dan Cahill and Richard Barrios, author of the recently published book entitled West Side Story, The Jets, the Sharks, and the Making of a Classic. We're so glad to have you join us. And please, Gary, begin.
Well, thank you, Norma. Welcome, everyone. In this remarkable week of fast-breaking news developments, and I can barely keep up with today's particularly, I found myself in the past 36 hours via a series of coincidences seeing the following things. On Broadway last night, the exuberant revival of Stephen Sondheim's Company, with several nearby Broadway houses unfortunately closed, as well as viewing both Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins' 1961 film of West Side Story. And this morning at 9 a.m. in Kips Bay, Steven Spielberg's just released remake, along with some occasional Spider-Man explosions from an adjacent cinema. So please excuse me if I'm reeling a bit here from an embarrassment of both musical riches and cinematic contradictions, which I hope we can dig deeper into today with both our home team and a very special expert guest. Now, Max, reissue trailers for classic films can often be slapdash pieces of work, but our beloved United Artists evidently took some care with this one.
They did, and I remember seeing this trailer at a calendar house in the 1970s. This is the 1968 reissue of West Side Story. The original trailer, which is available on the Blu-ray edition of the film, mostly consists of illustrations. It doesn't really have a lot of actual clips from the film itself, whereas the reissue does. And as Gary says, there was some care that went into this to really capture the spirit and the cinematic ingenuity of the original picture. So let's take a look at the reissue trailer from 1968 of West Side Story.
Unlike other classics, West Side Story grows younger.
All right, now, come on. Shoot it, man, shoot it. Yeah!
You hoodlums don't own the streets. Go play in the park. Keep off of the grass. Get out of the house. Keep off the block. Get out of here. Keep off the oil. A gang that don't own the street is nothing.
and we'll halfway there. Hold my hand and I'll take you there. Somehow, someday,
Unlike other classics, West Side Story grows younger.
Of course, we serious West Side people know that it's filmed in Panavision 70, as in 70 millimeter, which
You read my mind. Those sharp images reminded me of the fact, and maybe Dan will have something to say about this too. I'd say only 4 or 5 dozen Hollywood films were actually shot with 70 millimeter cameras. Does that sound right?
You mean Hollywood musicals?
Or just big Hollywood pictures in general? Not that many were actually shot with 70 mil cameras.
I would say it went over the dozen mark. I mean, you did have the epics like in the Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia range. When it came to musicals, there were not many. There was, of course, West Side Story, and there was The Sound of Music and Star, and just a couple of others. But
the ill-fated Porgy and Bess by Otto Preminger,
and
we talked
Porgy
about
and Bess as well. And I don't know about you, Gary, but to me, for decades, I have been amassing so many conspiracy theories about this film. Who directed what? Who was fired? Who was replaced? Who dubbed whom? And I got so frustrated not knowing how to get the answers. And fortunately, we have a guest today who's going to help us answer those questions. So
I've always wondered that too. Where this is only one of 2 Oscar winners for Best Picture that has a dual director credit. Maybe we'll see who can come up with the other one on our comments line here. But Jerome Robbins gets co-directing credit, and we're told by our guest that he accepted the Oscar on Oscar night, but there was a lot of switchblades and ash cans going on, I think, in between all that.
it's an amazing story, and we were so honored today to have Richard Barrios with us today. Richard Barrios is the author of this amazing book that Norma mentioned, West Side Story, The Jets, the Sharks, and the Making of a Classic. It's published by Turner Classic Movies, and it is the equivalent of getting access to some classified government files. There are so many mysteries that are solved in this book about the production of the movie. And I have 350 or close to 1,000 questions for Richard. Gary's going to have to keep me in line. And of course, we have to get Dan to chime in, as well as our guest today. Richard Barrios is the author of the award-winning A Song in the Dark, The Birth of the Musical Film. He also wrote Screened Out, Playing Gay in Hollywood, From Edison to Stonewall, Dangerous Rhythm, Why Movie Musicals Matter, and Turner Classic Movies Must-See Musicals. He's presented films at the Smithsonian Institution and Film Forum here in New York. He served as a co-host on Turner Classic Movies. He's appeared in documentary films, and he's contributed to audio commentaries to numerous DVD and Blu-ray releases. Needless to say, it's a great honor to have with us Richard Barrios. Richard, welcome to New Plaza Cinema Online.
Thank you. It is an immense pleasure to be here. I've so enjoyed meeting you all, and I'm very, very glad to be here. So thank you for having me.
Richard, when you were writing this amazing book, which by the way, people can purchase through Barnes and Noble and that other big online company, or you can ask your local bookstore to order it. When you were researching this book, was it, I mean, did you find yourself just calling out Eureka throughout your research project as you were going through paperwork? And how did you find out some of the secrets to the making of the film?
Well, for me, a lot of it had to do with taking a trip. I live in suburban Philadelphia on the New Jersey side, and taking a trip out for a few days to Los Angeles and going to the University of Southern California, USC, which has an amazing cinema collection. And several of the studios have left pretty much all their papers and scripts, and individuals have as well. And one of those individuals, very happily, was the redoubtable Robert Wise, who was a co-producer and co-director of West Side Story, and of course many other outstanding films as well. And very happily, Mr. Wise saved pretty much close to everything. And there were boxes of materials on West Side Story, and I was able to go through just about everything he had there. And so it really gave me a kind of large scale sense of what it was like putting this movie together. And most especially, and this was that sort of happy revelation for me, I mean, you know, West Side Story has been around now for 60 years, and it's fair to say I think we've taken it for granted because it's been with us. But the care and deliberation and thought, as well as artistry that went into making it, it was not at its time an assembly line musical. For one thing, it wasn't made at a big studio. The big studios were still operational in 1960 when it was shot, but this was an independent production, and it was almost like artisans putting together this very small, hand-tooled, meticulously wrought object, and they put that much thought and craft and skill and love into it. And Mr. Wise's papers really made this all very, very clear to me. And so after that happened, I started seeing the movie through newer eyes. And then one of the aspects of that I found really, really eye-opening, so much so that I devoted a whole chapter to it in the book, was the casting process for this movie. You know, they did not know on day one they were going to put Natalie Wood in and Rita Moreno and, you know, a lot of the others. They went through, and Wise in particular, went through this long and arduous process. And as I've already noted in a couple of interviews, just about the only people that were not considered for roles in West Side Story were Margaret Hamilton and Vincent Price. Just about everyone else was on the table. They really did. Wise talked to so many people and tested a lot of people. And, you know, some of them make you scratch your head a bit. Frankie Avalon. But, you know, hey, they really were after getting the best possible talent together in front of the camera as well as behind the camera.
Well, the section on the casting is amazing. It is astonishing the names that were being considered. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Robert Redford came up as he was starting out, and there was also talk of even Warren Beatty. Is that correct, as Tony?
And Warren Beatty had actually been considered for the original Broadway production. We found Bernstein, Mr. Bernstein had listened to him sing when they were, you know, start putting the cast together for the original show. And then Beatty did it. And it was interesting. They went back. They were still thinking about Warren Beatty for Tony. and they went back and looked at some clips from the movie Splendor in the Grass, which was still in production when they were planning West Side Story. And their eyes went from Beatty to Natalie Wood. And so Beatty ended up not being cast in the movie, but of course Natalie Wood did. So, but he was in the running for a while. And so, Redford was very, very seriously under consideration. And for, as I said in the book, if you have seen a lot of episodes of series television from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you have seen a lot of the people being considered for Tony and Maria and Riff and Anita and Bernardo, because people like Doug McClure, who was a serious candidate for the role of Tony. And over and over, you'll see these familiar names from television, especially. Mary Tyler Moore was interviewed before she even had the Tyler in her name. It was that early on. So it was well before the Dick Van Dyke Show and all. But she was, Wise spoke to her, but thought that she read too mature to play Maria, even though she was the same age as Natalie Wood, but just read more mature on screen. And over, all these people they spoke to. And of course, West Side Story is, as we all know, a musical. And what was very striking to me was the fact that singing was not necessarily a primary consideration in the casting of this movie. It was thought of, well, if they can sing, it's nice, but it's not necessarily vital, because the associate producer, Saul Chaplin, had already been an old hand at fitting on-screen faces with off-screen voices who were not, the same people. And it had already been pretty much decided that they would go very, very heavily on the dubbing. And so they would have liked maybe for one or two of more of the actors to have been able to do their own singing, but it was never a serious primary consideration in the film. And of course, that is one of the things that sometimes people are, wonder about with the original film, is why they didn't do it. And it's because it wasn't as crucial to them as we might have thought.
Well, we know, Richard, about Natalie Wood, but now you seem to be suggesting it was quite a bit more dubbing than I think many of us are under the impression of other key players. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Jimmy Bryant, the off-screen singer, dubbed Richard Beamer all the way through. Beamer would have liked to have tried to do his own singing, but he wasn't even given the option. Natalie did record her songs and shot her song numbers using her own voice for playback, even though behind the scenes they were not really seriously thinking that it was going to be released with her voice. Rita Moreno was dubbed in her version of A Boy Like That. It was an off-screen singer named Betty Wand, although Rita does her own singing in the most of the Rumble scene, and in America, it is Rita's voice. And Russ Tamblyn does his own singing in G. Officer Krupke, but earlier on in his version of Jet Song, he recorded it, and then Saul Chaplin decided near the last minute that he preferred having another singer. So another cast member, one of the Jets, who could do a good Russ Tamblyn imitation, actually was hired to do his singing. And you listen to the two recordings side by side, and they're very similar. But Mr. Tamblyn was understandably pretty irked about that. And Natalie Wood was livid. She was furious that they had done this, that they had told her originally that she would be singing, or had implied that she'd be singing, and had let her record the songs. And then and then it was taken away from her.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I'm sorry, Gary, did you have another?
No,
follow?
go ahead, Max. We'll get to that.
Because we will shortly with Dan be talking more about the look of the film, and we'll also be talking with you, Richard, about who did what. But it is unusual. We have two directors, Robert Wise and Jerome Robbins, and it's generally assumed, or I mean, by someone who didn't know the history, that the two were sitting side by side patiently throughout the entire production, making decisions. And apparently, you're laughing, so apparently that was not the case.
They would have loved for it to have been so, but life does not always follow expectations. And they knew the main producer, Walter Mirisch, had seen the show on Broadway, and he knew immediately that Jerome Robbins had to be part of the movie because the original show reflected Jerome Robbins's vision more than it did any other single person's. He was West Side Story, essentially. And so he was, they knew he had to be part of the movie, but he had virtually no screen experience. The only film that he had really worked on in any capacity was he had done the dances for The King and I in 1956. So you couldn't give him the entire movie. So they approached Robert Wise, who had virtually no musical film experience at all. He had worked on a film with a nightclub setting that had songs in it. But otherwise, he did almost every other genre known to woman, man, or anything else, including science fiction and film noir and westerns and many, many, many other things, but had never done a musical. So they figured that in ways that would benefit the film, that Wise, with his filmmaking expertise, and Robbins, with his vision and skill in choreography and musical considerations, would be a good balance and complement. And okay, in some ways it was, but there were factors that made it more difficult than they would have liked, which is why Mr. Robbins more or less did not make it to the end of the shoot.
Well, we're gonna get back to that because that's so important about scenes that Robbins worked on. But let's bring Daniel Cahill on now. Dan is he's a filmmaker. He's taught film at New York Film Academy, and he often discusses the look of the pictures we talk about here at New Plaza. Dan, I thought before we return, all four of us, to talk more about the making of and the behind the scenes, share with us some of your visual thoughts about the original West Side Story.
Happy to. While I'm calling this up on my screen share, I just want to say that it appears, oh gosh, I'm not connecting to my PowerPoint. Give me a moment, folks. If you guys want to talk about something else, this may take me another minute.
Well, we will continue, and then you just give us the high sign, Dan, when you're ready to jump in.
Will do.
So, Richard, things are, I mean, I would say they're going well in the beginning with Robbins and Wise working together. I presume from your book, a lot of this was the New York location filming where Robbins his influence was most greatly felt. Is that correct?
I would say that, and those were the first scenes to be shot in the film. They front-loaded the location work. So before then, there had been months of preparation in California, where with Robbins working with the dancers, and especially, and Wise was one of the producers of the film, so he was seeing to a lot of other things, including, as Dan will talk about, the look of the film, because he was working a lot with the art director Boris Levin. So they had both kind of had their own bailiwicks and would converse. But then when you get to New York and the very beginning of the filming, particularly those wonderful first minutes of the film that are shot on the streets of what was still New York in 1960, and a lot of it does not exist anymore. That was the first time they actually were, had the tandem directorial arrangement. And that ended up from very, very early on being difference and working styles of the two directors, which it was clear from pretty early on did not always mesh well.
Terrific. We will get back to that. And Dan, it looks like you're ready. So we'd love to hear more of your thoughts on the visual look. Oh, Dan, and we need you to unmute.
There we are. Yeah, sorry about that. One thing that's clear is that both directors and producers, everybody had a mission here to not remind anyone that this began on a stage. There are very few shots in this movie that mimic the proscenium, and I will not be showing them. I will be showing all of the very cinematic stuff that Messieurs Wise and Robbins put together here. This is the opening dissolve from Saul Bass's marvelous opening titles to the opening shot of Lower Manhattan, right in the middle of the dissolve. Here we are. I just learned something interesting today. Mr. Wise had a recently previous film, a noir heist film called Odds Against Tomorrow, which begins with a shot of a clover leaf near the Triborough Bridge. It's establishing New York locations. That was filmed from an adjacent rooftop. This from a helicopter with allegedly Mr. Wise sometimes hanging outside by somebody holding onto his belt. Another great aerial shot of a familiar building. Here we have our first views of human beings, and you will notice one thing that a lot of filmmakers love to do is insert things between the camera and the people they're photographing. And fences play a big part in this. Fences will return shortly. Here is another thing. I'm still not sure what that was, steps leading to something, but they fell in love with these shots that only partially reveal the cast. Here we have Richard Beamer as Tony, encased in his captivating, containing environment. Notice all of the lines that entrap him into New York City. He's got brick masonry. He's got railings. Above him, the floor of a fire escape. And of course, lines of laundry hanging in the background. This man clearly knows that something's coming. And here it is. He's met Maria, and we get into a more pictorial, almost fantasy world as he's singing his song. We have a salmon-colored sky behind him. Here we have a glorious green-lit warehouse, some sort of commercial building, maybe not even in New York. I'm not sure. Maybe Richard can tell us. What is that building, Richard? Do you know? You're muted. You're muted, Richard.
That was on a sound stage. That was not location work at all. That was in the studio. Okay. That was designed and lit for the film.
Thank you. Thank you. And this, according to Beamer, in an interview, was the last wrap shot, the martini of the whole production. This was the last thing that they shot during the production of the film. I love this shot. I'm a fan of cinematography, and I have to give a tip of the hat to Daniel Pfapp, the DP on this production. Apparently, this idea sprang from Robert Wise's brain, and Pfapp was more than happy to execute it. This is a beginning to acknowledge Robert Wise's background in noir films. I just ran through his biography or filmography today and noted 7 titles that could be described as noir films. Not that this is a noir film, but there's plenty of noir in it. I love this effect of using focus to highlight people or objects in a film. Sadly, this looks a little bit like the lame selfies that people do with their upright smartphones, but it's still a very effective shot, and it tells you that Tony and Maria are definitely together. Now, in this balcony scene, they went crazy finding ways to put objects between these two people. Here we have steps on the fire escape, railings on the fire escape. Now we have height in addition to the railings. I'm beginning to really love these shots. These are excellent, excellent shots. Once again, I'm assuming thanks to Robert Wise. And here we start to see noir creeping in as Tony is silhouetted against the night backdrop of Maria on her balcony. I love this shot just as a tableau. At first, as I was studying this location, I looked at that and thought, you know, that may be a set with forced perspective to look like it's getting smaller in the background when it's actually not part of the background. But I was wrong, and I watched the scene again, and sure enough, Tony enters on the very back wall and comes forward and climbs over the chain link fence. So this is a real set. I will say I have never seen the underside of a highway bright red before, but hey, they had a fetish for red backgrounds here, a la the brick wall behind Barnardo and the dance at the gym, so why not? Colors are very important in this film, as I was just saying. And here Daniel Fapp used the colored panes in Maria's bedroom door to great effect, shooting through them, using them in the mirror. Lovely. Here we are in Noir City. This had to come from Robert Wise. This is the noir playbook par excellence. This is a frame from the Cool number, and I just want to note the low ceiling. You don't see low ceilings in Hollywood films very much. One reason is that they're very hard to light. And the story has it that this was a major, major hardship for the dancers getting through this. And apparently the low ceiling just made the set all that much hotter and tiring for everybody. Another noir shot, the silhouetted figure at the end of a night street. Here we have a fence. Tony longing to be on the other side of that fence. Tony in agony, another noir shot. And here we have an orgy of fences. Maria on her side of the fence. And this is the fence shot par excellence again. I can't even count how many fences there are in this shot, but they clearly had fun setting this up. And this brings us now to the end, courtesy of Saul Bass and his exemplary titles, both at the head of the movie and at the tail end of the movie. That's all I have, guys.
Dan, that was phenomenal. And I have to say, between Richard's book and your explanation, I have even more respect for the film, because I too assumed the scene of Tony walking by that bank of windows lit from behind in green. Oh, that's location. Yeah. Richard says it wasn't.
No.
Then early on, as George Chakiris is walking along a bright red wall down the street, my initial response is, oh, that's studio. That's so backlot. But it wasn't. That was location.
No.
Tell us more.
Robert Wise had, and sometimes with the screenwriter Ernest Lehman, had taken several trips late in 1959, early in 1960 to New York to scout locations. It was Robert Wise's notion that the film should use actual locations, which was not Jerome Robbins's preference. He would have preferred to have shot the whole thing in the studio. So this did end up being a compromise, because Wise certainly had his way with the famous opening of the film, which was all shot on location in Manhattan, and then it goes to the studio for almost all the rest of the film. But Wise scouted a lot in the city to find what he considered to be photogenic, sites. And of course, as is well known, in the movie, it appears that the playground and the street are right adjacent to each other, but in reality, they were 4 miles apart. The playground is on the Upper East Side, and it's still there, and it's relatively recognizable, whereas the street is completely gone. Even the street itself was obliterated for the Lincoln Towers complex that was put there. But those, when the street was still there, because they filmed right before the buildings got knocked down, they did a lot of redecorating, let's call it, of the streets to shoot those early scenes. And a lot of things got sort of transformed and painted and redecorated to create what we see now in the film.
And that's a very powerful symbol. Go ahead, Gary.
I'm sorry. You mentioned, Richard, one particular spot, which is kind of a pilgrimage for West Side Story fans, I believe on the West Side. Could you pinpoint exactly where that is for us?
Oh, you mean the playground on the east side or the street on the
Well, maybe
street that's
I'm
gone?
confused. I think you did say there was a playground, and maybe that's the one, the East Side playground that's still
Yes.
visited.
That is, oh gosh, is it 101st Street? I went there. I don't. It's. I
I'll tell
think
you, it's East 110th.
that. Okay, yes, and it's now. Is it now called Tito Puente Way or something like? It's. There's part of it that's named after a famous person. I know that, but I did go there, and it is actually. There's been some rebuilding and some changes in the last 60 plus years, but when you're there, you can feel the vibe, and there's enough of it that's recognizable that it's kind of if you love West Side Story, it's a sacred spot.
East 110, and what's the avenue, the cross avenue?
I think it's between First and Second Avenues. I think it's like
That
right in
sounds
the middle of the block.
Great, thank you.
You'd think by now they'd make it a historic landmark, but that is a very powerful
Would.
section of your book.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's very powerful in your book when you talk about the whole Lincoln Square, San Juan Hill area, and all the redevelopment nightmare that was going on in the slum clearance. Very powerful stuff, and how Wise was catching certain blocks literally at the last moment of their existence.
And actually had to pay the contractors sort of under the table to refrain, to go elsewhere with the wrecking balls so that they could shoot the streets that they wanted to use for the film, because otherwise they would have been knocked down a little bit earlier. And so they were able to pay money to keep them long enough to film. And some of the buildings that they filmed in front of were only the fronts. The backs were already gone. And through they had to be very, very careful of what they shot to make it look like it was still, somewhat of an active community. Whereas it was, by then it had already been a ghost town, and the people who were living there had already been, forced to leave.
And it's pretty much a given that all but the gym dance sequence, all the musical numbers, with the exception of the gym dance sequence, were supervised in part by Jerome Robbins. Is that correct? Or the dance numbers, let's say.
The major dance numbers, yes. And he choreographed the gym dance number, but that started being shot basically the day after he was discharged. And so that was Wise. And if you really look at the gym dance with a very, acute critical eye, you can see that cinematically it may not have the final degree of polish that some of the other sequences do, like the prologue or Cool in particular, that even though Wise was on the set, Robbins really had pretty much total dominion over these numbers. And of course, it was Robbins's incredible perfectionism that in some ways sort of sealed his fate to be discharged from the film, because he was never so satisfied that he didn't want to go back and reshoot and do take after take after take, which is why we have the brilliance that we have on film, but it also came at a very, very high financial cost that the producers were very, very aware of. And so they basically decided that the things that Robbins had to be in charge of, once he got those done, that Wise would be able pretty much to manage the rest of it. So that was how and you wonder, and there's no verification of this at all, but you wonder if even going in there might have been some thought, because the way the shooting had been, the schedule had been arranged, was that the musical numbers and the things that Robbins would have had the most dominion over were earlier in the shoot, and the more non-musical sequences were primarily what came later on. So you wonder if someone thought, well, if he's trouble, then we can cut him and still be able to do the movie. And I don't wish to be cynical about it, but come on, it's Hollywood we're talking.
It's Hollywood. Be as cynical as you want. You're probably going to be right on target. So, Richard, obviously it's a given. We all know it's the best kept, or it's the worst kept secret that Marnie Nixon dubbed Natalie Wood's vocals. And as you indicated, Natalie Wood was a little surprised when this happened. You, as I understand it, actually heard some of the original recordings of Natalie Wood singing her songs. Can you share your thoughts on that? What was that like?
At one point in her career, Natalie Wood did consider having a singing career. She had worked on a movie with Sinatra, and they got along very, very well. And she did a TV special with him and sang with it. And so she sort of fancied herself, a possible singer. And she was very, very eager to do the songs for Maria herself. And she did not have a lot of lead time on the film to prepare either the singing or the dancing. She had a really, really concentrated block of time to work on all this, but she did work with a vocal coach and did record all the numbers and shot them to her own playbacks, her own recordings. Meanwhile, while she was in the recording studio doing that, Marnie Nixon was there, physically present for a lot of that. And Natalie kind of knew who she was, and they told her that Marnie would be there to maybe sweeten some of the recordings if a note needed to be here or there put in or something like that, which Marnie had done in previous films already.
I just want to interrupt. For those of you who are curious, on this Blu-ray edition of the movie, there is a disc of extra features, and you can get to see the full song, I Feel Pretty, the film of it resynced with Natalie Wood's original voice.
Yes.
And you'll notice a difference. I'm not saying she's terrible, but it's a little thinner voice than Marnie Nixon's. Just putting that out there.
Yeah. One thing I mentioned in the book would be at this remove 60 years later, there would be no question that someone as famous as Natalie would have had her own vocals used and electronically manipulated to give them a little more body. And she did not have an unpleasant voice, and she actually got to sing with her own voice shortly after West Side Story in the film of Gypsy, where depending which source, it's either all of it is her singing or most of it is her singing. And she was very glad about that, because she had, when she was told near the end of shooting that she would not be doing her vocals would not be used for Maria, she was really, really, really angry. And she had already been incensed and hurt by the firing of Jerome Robbins, with whom she had bonded. And she liked Robbins very much and was not particularly taken with Robert Wise. So she had that. And then when it came to the singing, and she found out that they were going to use Marnie Nixon's vocals and not hers, she was livid. And that is why in later years, she would never tend to talk about West Side Story with any great fondness, because for her, it represented some kind of failure or letdown. And that she was very, very hurt by that. And, it was the most financially successful film of her career. But she saw it as, that they had thought she wasn't good enough. And that really, really bothered her.
Some of our attendees have commented Natalie Wood does her own singing in Gypsy, and even inside Daisy Clover, she does some of her own vocals in that picture. There's controversy about Wood's casting, the wavering Spanish accent and so on. But that last scene at the very end in the playground, I feel she makes up, and I presume with Robert Wise's assist power behind the camera, whatever deficiencies there were beforehand. It's so powerful, her appearance in that last scene, that it actually overshadows the new version. And I think that Rachel Zegler is outstanding as Maria in the new version. She's fantastic, but there's that devastating emotional impact that you have in the original that I didn't feel at the end of the new one. I think Natalie Wood had a lot to do with that. That's just my thoughts.
I agree with that completely. The 61 film has a couple of added lines that they gave Natalie Wood that are not in the newer version, right in that scene. And Wood really delivers it. And with I Can Kill Too, pull the trigger. I mean, she really, really gets to the power of it. As my personal thought is that Natalie Wood was an uneven performer when you got her when she was really, really good. She really, really connected with the role and with the audience. And you see it off and on in West Side Story. And as you said, Max, for many people, the wavering nature of the accent is an issue. And some of that comes with the short amount of lead time that she had working on the role, because she was the last major actor to be cast in the film. And they had already started the location shoot in New York before she was even signed for it. So she had a very, very short lead time to work on that, to work on the dancing, to work on the singing. That's a lot for one person. And Rita Moreno and someone we just lost a few weeks ago, Yvonne Wilder, also known as Yvonne Othon, who plays one of the Sharp girlfriends, both worked on her with her to some extent on the accent, but there's a reason why a lot of people don't see it as being really authentic. I think that's valid.
This is really wonderful, and I think right now this may be a good opportunity to start taking questions and thoughts from our viewers, and I'll assist my Zoom hosts, or I will ask for assistance from our Zoom hosts to help make that happen. Just want to do a reminder before we start taking Q&A. This Tuesday at 4:00 Eastern Time, as Lori mentioned at the beginning, will be the final for the year film craft class that I'm giving. I will be talking, it's called The Camera Dances, and it has to do with extended, uninterrupted, unedited camera movements from such directors as Orson Welles and many others. And it's a subject close to my heart. It's my favorite of my topics that I've spoken about. And it's a pleasure to be presenting it to New Plaza on Tuesday. Just a reminder.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm sorry, Max, did I catch you?
No, that's, and of course, to be sure to buy Richard's book on West Side Story. It's a great stocking filler for the holidays.
I have to just say this movie and I are the same age, and this has just been such a treat. Thank you so much, Richard. I have like a gajillion questions, but we have many guests who have questions as well. So if anyone does have a question, please raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you. Right now, we only have one. Janice Greer, can you unmute and start your video, please?
Yes, I have a question about Marnie Nixon. I've been recently listening to the 61 soundtrack. She has sometimes a Spanish accent when she sings the Maria songs, sometimes not always. Do you have any information on that, Richard?
She was under a certain amount of constraint as she was later with My Fair Lady, in the fact that usually the way things worked were the recordings were made, audio recordings were made first, and then they were used when they shot. But in the case of West Side Story with Natalie Wood and with Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady, the stars had been originally told that they would be doing their own singing and did the recordings, and so Marnie kind of had to fit into that template. I agree with you that the accent comes and goes, and sometimes for me it's overdone, and then sometimes it's underdone, and it's distracting. That probably, I could just say, that wasn't one of the primary considerations back then. We can look at it now and say it should have been a bit more under control. But as we know, this was 60 years ago, and things like that were not necessarily always dealt with the sensitivity and awareness that we would bring to it now, and that Mr. Spielberg was certainly intent on bringing to the new version.
Richard, would you agree that had Natalie Wood known she was going to be dubbed by Marnie Nixon, and they were she was singing to playback of Marnie Nixon, maybe it would have been a little less jolting? Would that have had anything? Because as you mentioned in your book, Deborah Carr knew she was being dubbed for King and I, but
yeah,
would that have made a difference, do you think?
It might have. Deborah Carr and Natalie Wood were very different personalities, off and on the screen. I think it's hard to know. Part of the issue was that Natalie Wood was never as committed maybe to West Side Story as some of the other cast members were, where Rita Moreno, who's so identified with Anita and brought so much of her own life and passion to the film, where Natalie Wood had just done that with the movie Splendor in the Grass, where she had worked with Elia Kazan. And this for her wasn't as committed a project for her. So, it's awfully hard to know. What is clear, unfortunately, is that when you hear the singing voice coming out of Natalie Wood's mouth on screen, you're conscious that it's not Natalie Wood, because she and Marnie Nixon were not necessarily the best vocal match, I feel, and which was also true later with My Fair Lady. But Deborah Carr, who got to work with Marnie in The King and I, it's a wonderful match. That's one of the single best examples of dubbing, I think, in any film.
Well stated.
All right, next up is AR, is it? Could you unmute yourself and start your video?
Yes, hi there. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you.
Excellent. I was just freezing for a moment. I have a couple of thoughts. Once again, thanks again for a wonderful discussion, as always. You guys are always brilliant. One question I had, I happen to be seeing the new version tomorrow. I'm wondering whether you might want to talk about it a little bit more in depth. What might you tell someone to look out for? What interesting tales might you tell about the new West Side Story?
Who goes first?
For a second, because we had a conversation prior to this, and I think the popular consensus, and gentlemen, correct me if I'm wrong, there's great aspects in each movie, and it's almost like you wish you could take this from here and that from there. But I think each one is a great movie unto itself. I just think, as a true fan, that I was looking for a remake and not a cancel culture, politically correct. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's positives to be had in both films. And like, what can't Steven Spielberg do, guys, for real? You know?
I mean, personally, I preferred the Officer Krupke number in the new version. He sets it in a police precinct. I thought it was wonderfully staged. I like although I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with them moving I Feel Pretty later in the narrative, but I liked his staging in the Gimbel's department store setting of I Feel Pretty. That was just my takeaway. So there are little things that the new version, I think, strengthened or added to.
One thing that I think really separates the two versions, and I think that was deliberate, was that the original, the 61 film, really confines its action with these characters into one, like, what, three or four block area. Whereas the new one ranges out, it goes to Gimbel's, it goes to the cloisters, and so it goes out. So it's a different sort of take on the material. I tend to prefer the confinement a little more, because I think that was the notion that they were, going with for the first version. But as has been said, these films in some ways are not really competitive, because each finds its own path, goes along that path, and realizes what it sets out to do, and in very, very different ways. And some of the technical considerations are now, this film now the new film probably seems a bit more technically polished in our eyes. But as I noted the other day when we were talking about this, how do we know what the new one is going to look like in 60 years? What will have happened artistically and technologically by then? So, we have no way of knowing. But I really do appreciate the fact that with both films, the filmmakers really believed in the material, had their own takes on it, and did pretty much everything in their power to realize that take. It's just not always completely the same take.
Well stated. And what surprised me, having looked at the original last night, Simon Oakland's Lieutenant Schrank, he's much more of a rotten character in the Wise film than the same part played by Brian Darcy James. He's sort of a kinder, gentler Schrank, and I'm not sure why that decision was made. I just think
that's actually, excuse me, I think you're referring to Corey Stoll, who plays
Corey Stoll.
Corey Stoll, yeah.
And
Corey Stoll.
Brian Darcy
James.
Brian is an old acquaintance of mine. He is Officer Krupke, and he plays that role.
I meant thank you, Corey Stoll. Thank you.
And Krupke actually gets quite a bit more play in this one than he did in the 1961 version. And another character who gets quite a bit more play, and I think to the benefit of the film, and I won't give anything away, but the character of Chino, Maria's suitor, who really is given a great deal more screen time and depth.
Very different
this time, and I think that really works in this film with the take on the material that Mr. Spielberg and crew and cast have on it, I think.
By the way, I also have an incredible problem with the politically correct aspect of so many things that I see these days. It's like we're all walking on tender pebbles. Thank you for your answer. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Hey.
Enjoy the film tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, do. Joshua, you want to unmute? And then we have some questions in the.
Am I unmuted?
You
Yes,
are.
You are.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question that's a little off center. I love the film of West Side Story. I think it's just really unique. And living on the West Side, I appreciate it. But the off center question, I love the dancing in the movie, particularly. And I was wondering, Russ Tamblyn, I saw him next in Seven Brides. That was a wide angle shot film also. Was that 80 millimeter?
Well, that was CinemaScope 35 millimeter. So it's a 70 millimeter. West Side Story was a wider format film, but they both have a kind of a rectangular letterbox look to them.
Yeah, and Seven Brides was actually shot both ways. It was shot in the conventional screen, but what really sold it was being one of the early widescreen CinemaScope musicals. And West Side Story was shot wide as well, but the film was much wider, so that when it's projected, it has a great deal more sharpness and definition to it than earlier CinemaScope movies did, which were only 35 millimeter.
Thank you.
Particularly Seven Brides, I think, has that format, Max. I think it was like 2:5:5:1, right? Which I think
Yes.
later
The early ones were really wide.
It
Yeah.
was too wide.
Yeah.
I originally saw it at Radio City Musical.
Wow.
Wow.
It was a surprise hit.
It was, and MGM thought that their big musical that season was going to be Brigadoon, and Brigadoon ended up tanking, and Seven Brides went through the roof. And speaking about Mr. Tamblyn and his dancing, he was not trained as a dancer. He was trained as a gymnast. And that is why in both Seven Brides and in West Side Story, you get to see him doing some rather amazing flips.
Backflipping.
The one he does in the gym in West Side Story is just eye-popping. And at first, he and Robbins maybe eventually got to where they had a grudging respect for one another. But Tamblyn did not like the way that Robbins was a stern taskmaster with the dancers. Tamblyn wasn't happy with that. But originally, Robbins had told him, "No, you're not going to do any of your gymnastic tricks in this movie. You're not going to do flips and all that." And then, of course, by the time they shot it, yes, he did, and Robbins was glad he did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua.
A question was asked about the participation of Stephen Sondheim. Sadly, he passed, a week before its release, a week or two. Can you speak to that, Richard? Do you know about his involvement? I saw him on the...
You mean in the new version, Laura? You're talking about the new version?
Yes.
Okay.
I know that he did get to see the new version a while before he passed, and he was very, very happy with it. He actually came on the Late Show with Stephen Colbert and extolled its praises to the skies, the Spielberg version. I think that Mr. Sondheim usually felt pretty, he wasn't impressed with the movie medium very much. He did not like the way the film of Gypsy had turned out. And with West Side Story, he always kind of put down his own contributions. He would later on talk about how his lyrics to I Feel Pretty, he thought were not great work. I think he was underestimating his own abilities. But so he never talked that much about the original film of it, but he did love the remake. Now he did work on the 61 version because he was contracted to rewrite some of the lyrics to America. Because as soon as the show opened on Broadway, there were protests about the lines about Puerto Rico being an island of tropic diseases and all that. And that stayed in the show, but they changed it for the movie, and that was because Mr. Sondheim was contracted to change quite a few of the lyrics of America from what had been on the stage.
Weren't there some new changes in the new one as well?
Yeah, because in the original, for the American number, they do not have in the remake where the Anita character talks about always the population growing. I noticed that part was dropped.
No, I don't know for sure that Mr. Sondheim changed those, but he may well have, because he was around. But they kept some of the changes that had been done for the first film, and then they added some others of their own. And of course, they, just as the first film had completely changed the setting and especially the participants in the American number, because on the stage it had just been Anita and her friends doing the number. Then for the movie, the first movie, they added Bernardo and the Sharks, and they all did it together. And then now for the new version, it's all of them plus a large part of the community out on the street.
Someone had said earlier that I Feel Pretty in the movie, I feel like it came later, but she was saying that that's where it was in the original stage play.
That is correct. That is correct.
We should be giving prizes away, y'all.
Both versions of of West Side Story, both film versions, do a bit of shifting around. The 61 more so than the other. I Feel Pretty was moved, and so was Cool. And Cool was shifted back to pretty much its original position for the new version, but they had Tony singing it, whereas he had not sung it. It was Riff who sang it on Broadway. But I myself, and I think even Robbins did, preferred the way Cool got moved to later in the action for the 61 version. Cool is one of the sequences that I feel that the 61 version dramatically, staging-wise, setting-wise, really is the definitive version, far more than the new version. And as was commented earlier, that set was a killer. They built that parking garage in the studio with a very low ceiling, and Robbins worked those dancers as hard as he possibly could. And that is why the number is as brilliant as it is. That is also why after the number wrapped shooting, the dancers, the young jet gentlemen, gathered together their knee pads and did a ceremonial burning of them in an ash can outside the door of Robbins's office, because they were just glad that ordeal was done.
All right, we have another question. Susan Caleb, could you unmute yourself and start your video if you'd like? Hi, Susan. Welcome. You need to unmute yourself.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yes. Thank you. My question is, the original concept was to have Jewish and Irish gangs instead of, and I wonder why they discarded that original concept.
That was when it was very, very early on the in the minds of Mr. Robbins and some of his and Mr. Bernstein. And it was the East Side. It was going to be called East Side Story, and that was seen by that point as having gotten a bit cliched through overuse. And the one thing that they were really that really caused the Irish and Jewish conflict to have lost its luster was a very popular stage play called A.B.'s Irish Rose, which at the time, when it opened in the 1920s, was by far the longest running play in Broadway history, but it was so stereotypical that it kind of tainted forever after that whole dramatic notion of because it was seen as it dealt with so many crass stereotypes of both groups that once they started fleshing out that concept, they said, oh God, no, we can't do this because people won't accept it, because A.B.'s Irish Rose really did kind of ruin it. And that was sort of what caused them for a while to put the whole idea on hold for several years, actually, and they were all doing other projects. And then there started being stories in the press of various gang rivalries on both the East and West coasts. And that was what kind of rekindled with Arthur Lawrence and Jerome Robbins and eventually Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Sondheim came in a good deal later. Their idea, and they said, well, we have conflict, but this seems a more relevant way of portraying it. So that was when it became what we know now.
Very interesting. Thank you. I mean, it sounds very political and of that time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Politics has always been on the hovering around West Side Story. How could it not, given the subject matter?
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Richard Barrios, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank
you.
You
could go on for hours. We love the subject so much.
This is terrific. Thank you, Richard.
But I know we're out of time, and
thank you.
Sean will take over this time. But thank you again for joining
Thanks
us,
again.
Richard, and everyone.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, so much. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful and safe, happy, and holiday season and an amazing new year. I will see you then. And let me shift it over to Sean Moore. Sean?
Yes, everyone. Hi, thanks, Richard. What a treat for all of us to have you here.
Thank you.
It's just
thank you so much.
And obviously you just have a breadth of knowledge about so much, not just this movie, obviously. And it's just great to have you as a part of the family. We really, really appreciate that. And so I just want to remind everyone, his book really is a treasure. So if you love this movie, thank you, Max.
Thanks, Max.
There are so many neat details in this book that I really, and honestly, you guys, it's not particularly expensive. If you know someone that loves the movie, I personally have bought it as a gift this season for 2 or 3 family members. And I think it's just a great book. So hopefully others will find that. And I don't want you to forget that Tuesday is going to be a great lecture for Filmcraft with Max. You can find the information for that. Actually, it's not on our website. It's on Eventbrite, but you can also email me. You guys, you can email the host of this show and I can get you those details if you need them. And then just everyone, please have a wonderful holiday. Have a safe holiday. Take care of yourself because we want to see you next year. We'll be back next year with much more. So thank you again, everybody. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Merry, happy, everyone.
Yes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.